The movie begins with Mr. Snow and his helper arriving outside the Marston house to unload a crate, while his fellow is currently terrified to step outside. Mr. Snow orders him to open the cellar, but he is shaking in his shoes. However, the helper reluctantly gets off the truck and opens the cellar. He sees that it is pitch black dark inside the cellar. Afterward, they open the back of the truck and begin to unload the heavy crate. They carry it into the cellar with great difficulty. There, the heavy crate slips from helper's hand, causing the crate to break from the bottom. Mr. Snow and his sycophant observe that some kind of dirt came out of the unwieldy box instead of something invaluable, and seeing this, both of them are at their wits' end. Nevertheless, they shrug it off and set it down gently at the other place in the cellar. Mr. Snow hears someone whispering in the crate, and shortly after his eyes turn white as he approaches the unwieldy crate, but just then, his helper appears and asks him to get out very soon. Now, we see an author named Ben Mears, returning to his childhood hometown of Jerusalem's Lot to work on a new book. He takes a look at the Marston house, which is surrounded by towering trees and bushes, and after a while, he drives off. Later, he arrives at an office to take a place on rent. Here, he meets a young woman named Susan, who was going through a book written by him before his arrival. Shortly after, the owner of the office, Larry, arrives there. Ben tells Larry that he saw someone in the Marston house on the way in. He asks if anyone still lives in the Marston house. To which he responds that it has been sitting vacant for almost 40 years and it was bought by an European man who runs a shop across the street. Susan jumps into the conversation and reveals to Ben that Eva Miller has some rooms to let out over on Railway Street. After Ben's departure, Susan picks up the book and finds Ben's picture on the back of the book. Next, Ben arrives at Eva Miller's house, his new residence in this town. In the next scene, some children are playing in the playground of the school. Richie Bodden, a rich and bully guy, arrives there and knocks down Mark for no reason when his hands are tied up. After that, Richie starts leaving, but meanwhile, Mark gets back to his feet and knocks down Richie to teach him a lesson. He twists his arm and orders him to call him his uncle. Mr. Burke, a school teacher, arrives there and pulls them apart. Richie leaves after threatening Mark that he will see him later. Straker is in his antique shop and sees homebound schoolchildren through a hole in the canvas. Next, Straker comes to Danny and his younger brother Ralph and offers them a lift to their home, but Danny turns down his offer and takes a shortcut to his house, while Straker looks at them with malice. Elsewhere, Susan and Ben take a safe spot to have a wide view of the event, where thousands of cars are parked. She asks him why he came back to this town. He responds that he came back for his further research and reveals that his parents died in a car accident when he was 9. Therefore, my coming back to Salem's Lot is like my way of reclaiming home. Next, Danny and Ralph pass through a dense forest to reach their home before it is dark. Soon after, both the little boys feel someone chasing them, but they ignore it and continue to walk to their house. Ralph lags behind Danny and soon gets captured by a lurking entity. Danny looks behind and does not find Ralph coming after him. Afterward, we see that it was Straker who abducted Ralph. He unloads him from the trunk of his car and carries him into the Marston house while saying, "My master wants a sacrifice." Afterward, he begins to summon Mr. Barlow, saying, "I have brought you a sacrifice." Moments later, all the burning candles blow out on their own, indicating the arrival of Mr. Barlow. Pretty soon after, Mr. Barlow, who is a vampire, comes down the stairs, holding a candle in his hands, while Ralph continues to scream. Mr. Barlow savagely kills the little boy. Straker, the devotee of the vampire, witnesses this slaughter. Danny is shaken by the incident of Ralph's abduction. He hears noise outside the window, and when he goes near the window, he finds Ralph loitering in the lawn. Danny quickly goes downstairs but finds no one there in the foggy night. Right then, the seesaw swing begins to move on its own, and not long after, a demonic hand takes Danny away. Immediately after, Danny is before her mother and tells her that he is sick. Now, Danny is hospitalized and tries to reach the IV bag containing the blood being transfused into his body. Soon after, his mother Marjorie Glick wakes up and hears him saying water. Therefore, she goes to call the nurse to fetch water, but when she returns, she finds Danny drinking the blood from the IV bag, causing her to scream. Afterward, Danny leaves this world. Father Callahan performs his last rites at a cemetery, while his assistant Mike is having lunch behind a tree. When Mike woke up, it had become dark, meaning he just slept in. He gets up and begins to do his job, which is to bury the coffin of Danny. The coffin begins to move, drawing Mike's attention. He jitteringly approaches the grave and hears Danny crying for help. He quickly jumps into the grave and opens the coffin but finds Danny as calm as a cucumber, as he is already dead, and this catches Mike off guard. So, he closes the coffin and gets out of the pit and begins to throw the soil onto the coffin, but this time, he finds the coffin open, and moreover, the dead body of Danny is no longer in the coffin, and seeing this, Mike shakes in his shoes. He tries to flee but gets killed by Danny's evil soul. Mr. Burke arrives at a restaurant to clear the cobwebs away but finds Mike sitting in the shadow. He approaches him and asks him if he is alright. Mike tells him that he is sick and reveals that he passed out after Danny's funeral. The magnanimous Mr. Burke takes Mike straight to his house for a night stay. Mr. Burke notices some marks on his neck and gets suspicious of him. He pulls down the window unaware of the fact that he has brought a corrupt soul to his house. He comes downstairs and keeps pondering over Mike's situation. Just then, he hears some noise coming from upstairs. He comes outside and discovers someone getting into the house through the window. Immediately after, Mr. Burke visits Ben and asks him to get to his house, as he has something to show him. He explains to them that he saw someone going in through this window and the lights were on when he left. Afterward, they enter Mike's room and find him lying unconscious on the bed with the lights turned off. Mr. Burke touches Mike and finds his body as cold as ice. Moreover, he notices that the marks are no longer on his neck. Moments later, Dr. Cody arrives to check on Mike, but she also declares him dead. Next, Mark is sleeping in his bedroom, but his sleep is disturbed by the evil soul of Danny, who repeatedly knocks on the window and asks him to open it to let him in. Mark approaches the window and gets possessed by Danny, causing him to open the window. Danny gets in and informs Mark that Mr. Barlow is dying to meet him. Soon after, Mark gets back to his senses and scares away Danny, using a lightning cross. After this incident, Mark begins to do research on vampires. He comes to know that the vampires are afraid of wooden stakes and direct sunlight. Moreover, they can be repelled by a holy cross. On the other side, Mr. Burke is confronted by evil Mike, but he was ready to deal with him. By utilizing a holy lightning cross, he flings Mike against the wall. Mike gets away from there after catching a tartar. Mr. Burke starts searching for him but is attacked by the lurking Mike again. Mike comes down the stairs saying, "Mr. Barlow wants to meet you." Mr. Burke manages to grab a cross, causing Mike to get out of the house flying. Next, Mr. Burke reveals to Ben, Susan, and others that the vampires are afraid of the power of faith, wooden stakes, crosses, white roses and garlic. He explains that Ralph was a sacrifice to consecrate the grounds for Barlow's arrival, while Dr. Cody does not believe all this, as she thinks that vampires don't exist in this world. Elsewhere, Mark proceeds to the Marston house, holding a wooden stake in his hand. He opens the cellar and steps inside, heedless of the consequences. Upon going deeper, he is startled by the presence of Mr. Burke, who asks him to get out of the cellar straight away, as he doesn't have any idea what he is getting himself into there, but in the meantime, someone locks the cellar from outside. Mr. Burke lights a candle to brighten up the dark cellar and begins to look for a way out, while keeping Mark with him. Elsewhere in the cellar, a vampire begins to emerge from a box. Soon after, Burke's candle is blown out and then, he falls prey to Barlow, a deadly vampire. At the mortuary, Dr. Cody inspects the dead body of Marjorie, Danny, and Ralph's mother. Moments later, the corpse begins to move, horrifying everyone present there. The lifeless body of Marjorie begins to inquire about Danny. Dr. Cody, Susan, and Ben quickly improvise a makeshift cross to keep off the imminent danger. Marjorie turned vampire, sits up on the stretcher and moments after, falls upon Dr. Cody. She tries to bite her but Dr. Cody stabs her in the face but no blood comes out. Meanwhile, Susan places a radiating cross on Marjorie's back, causing her to scream, and soon she vanishes into thin air. Afterward, Ben, Susan and Dr. Cody arrive at Mr. Burke's house in a car but they find several vampires on Burke's roof. Ben reveals that they are too late, as Matt Burke must have turned into a vampire too. Next day at Marston House, Mark is seen hanging upside down with hands bound together and a piece of cloth gagging his mouth. Moments later, Straker turns up in the room but is ambushed by Mark, who manages to free himself somehow or other. Ultimately, Straker is killed by Mark. Elsewhere in the church, Father Callahan is visited by Dr. Cody, Ben, and Susan. Ben asks him if he has noticed anything unusual in the Salem's Lot recently. Thereafter, Dr. Cody reveals to him that the mortality rate has been rather higher in Salem's Lot lately. On this, he responds that he is well familiar with what's going on around here. Meanwhile, Mark shows up there after putting Straker to death. He reveals to Father Callahan that Mr. Burke has also turned into a vampire, and without wasting any time, Mark begins to fill his bottle with the holy water and tells them that Barlow is the head vampire. I couldn't lay my hands on him, but I managed to kill his servant, Straker, as it was the only way to get out. Everyone is blown away by this heroic feat of Mark. Father Callahan asks him to lead them to the Marston house, where all this turned up. Shortly after, all of them reach the outskirts of the sinister house. They enter the house in search of Straker's body. Just then, a door opens on its own. Ben and others descend into the basement, and shortly after, they encounter Mr. Burke turned vampire. They all freak out and start fleeing here and there. Vampire Burke grabs Ben's leg, but just then, Susan opens the door of the cellar, letting the sunlight fall upon Vampire Burke. Thereafter, Ben kills him, using a wooden stake through his heart. After that, they get out of the building and begin to make a plan to bring all the people of Salem's Lot to the church before the night comes, as no place is as safe as the church. Susan comes straight to her house to fetch her mother, but her mother tells her that she has just met an incredible man named Mr. Barlow. Just then, Susan is attacked by a vampire, but Ben saves her in time and takes her away. Elsewhere, Mark tries to convince his parents to go to the church before Barlow arrives there, but Mark's parents don't believe all this. At the precise moment, someone knocks on the door. Mark's father goes to answer the door. Meanwhile, Barlow attacks Mark's mother, sucking her blood to death. Father Callahan makes an effort to drive away Barlow using a cross, but he is not affected by it. The cross fades away because of Father Callahan's weak faith, prompting Vampire Barlow to kill Father Callahan. Mark flees the house, desperately trying to escape the demon vampire. He quickly climbs into the treehouse, where he encounters the evil Danny and others, and soon, the entire treehouse is surrounded by the vampire. In the next scene, Ben takes Susan to the church, as she is about to turn into a vampire soon. Ben implores Dr. Cody to help Susan by giving her a shot, but instead of a shot, she takes out a wooden stake to kill Susan, but meanwhile, Susan manages to free herself and runs away. Ben also goes after her to bring her back, but finds himself surrounded by numerous vampires. Having spotted the sanguinary vampires, he sprints for the church, but one of the vampires abducts him in midair, but shortly after, the vampire falls back to the ground after getting killed by Ben during this encounter. Ben is helped by Dr. Cody, who tries to frighten the lurking vampires by pointing the lightning cross towards them. Afterward, they both get inside the church in time and begin to wait for the daylight. The next morning, Dr. Cody and Ben return to the town, which seems desolate, as there is no trace of any human beings in the entire town. Following this, they arrive at Mark's house, where they find the corpses of Mark's parents and Father Callahan. Ben stumbles upon a note, left by Mark, stating that he is going to kill Barlow. Mark breaks into the antique shop of Straker, whose master is Vampire Barlow. Here, he is ambushed by Danny, but Mark stabs him with the wooden stake, killing him. Thereafter, he comes out of the shop, and comes across Ben and Dr. Cody. Moments later, the trio arrives at a place, where there are many parked cars. Ben opens the trunk of one of the parked cars and finds Vampire Susan sleeping in it. Meaning, this parking lot is the hiding place of vampires. Dr. Cody tells him that it is not Susan but just something that looks like her. Therefore, he lets Cody kill the Vampire Susan with a wooden stake, but just then she is shot to death by Susan's mother, who is in a possessed state at this time. After killing Dr. Cody, Susan's mother is determined to kill Ben and Mark, who hide behind cars to escape the frantic lady. While saving his life, Ben notices that with the setting sun, the vampires, who had been sleeping in the trunks, start waking up and coming out of them. Therefore, both Ben and Mark begin to sprint to the light. However, Ben is caught by a speeding vampire. Nevertheless, he asks Mark to run away from there. Mark gets in a car, and destroys the high board that was preventing the light from scattering everywhere. As soon as the sunlight falls on the advancing vampires, they are burned to ashes. This way, Ben is saved by Mark. Ben explains to Mark that they have to find Barlow before the sun sets. Just then, Mark's eyes fall on a truck, parked nearby. Ben opens the back of the truck and discovers a massive coffin, placed in it. They haul the coffin out of the truck and begin to pry it open, but at the same time, it starts getting dark. Both Ben and Mark get ready to strike at Barlow as soon as he shows up, but the coffin bursts open, causing Ben and Mark to fall to the ground. They escape to an adjacent room, where Ben is attacked by Susan. She tries to bite him while Ben makes an effort to bring her back to her senses. Outside, Mark encounters Barlow, standing high above on a platform. Having seen the devilish vampire, Mark starts fleeing. Elsewhere in the room, Susan leaves no stone unturned to get to Ben's neck, but Ben turns the tables on Susan, and kills her by stabbing her in the heart with a wooden stake. Outside, Barlow has trapped Mark and tries to make him one of his kind. However, he could not succeed in his mission, as Ben puts a stake through his head, leading to his death. Afterward, to kill him permanently, Ben pierces a stake through Barlow's heart, freeing the town from him. In the closing scene of the movie, Ben and Mark leave the ominous Salem's lot for good in a car, and this scene marks the end of this movie.